Hi! In this tutorial, I'm going to show you 6 really easy ways to frost a cake without a turntable or any fancy cake decorating supplies. I'm going to be using just one cake to show you all 6 techniques, so I'm using a folded piece of parchment paper to divide the cake into 6 equal parts, and I'm scoring down the side with a serrated knife to mark out my sections, continuing them onto the top of the cake as well. I've prepared 6 piping bags with different colours of frosting, just for fun, and they're fitted with different piping tips for each technique. A small petal tip, a 104, no tip, a 1M tip, a 4B tip, no tip, and a large petal tip, a 125. Normally I cover my cakes with a thin coat of frosting called a crumb coat before doing a final coat of frosting for the decorations, but for these techniques it's fine to go straight onto a naked cake. For the first section, I'm dividing the cake into 3 parts so I can do 3 columns of this pattern. I'm starting with my small petal tip and holding it so that the narrow end of the tip is pointing away from the cake. I'm applying pressure to the piping bag to squeeze out the frosting and moving the bag from side to side so that the frosting comes out in a ribbon shape, folding back over itself each time I change direction. I'm moving my wrist gradually higher up the cake as I pipe, so that the ribbons continue all the way up the cake, and I'm trying to stay within the 2 lines I've indented so that the ribbon goes straight up, but it's a bit tricky from this angle because I can't really see what I'm doing. It's definitely a good idea to do this facing the cake, ideally crouching down so that you're at eye level with the area you're piping over. When you need to adjust the piping bag to squeeze more buttercream to the end of the bag, release your pressure on the bag to stop piping in the middle of a section of ribbon, not on the edge, so that when you go back to it, the join is covered up by the next fold of buttercream ribbon. When you get to the top of the cake, go all the way up to the very top, and you can even do an extra fold of ribbon to make sure there's no cake exposed on the side. This is my 4-minute buttercream, and I've put the link for the tutorial and the recipe in the description below the video and also in the top of the screen. I'm doing 3 columns of these ribbons, and I'll leave the top of the cake to do later, moving on to the next technique for now. For this technique, I'm using a spoon and a piping bag with no tip. I've cut off the end of the piping bag, and I'll let the buttercream come out of that hole. I'm squeezing a row of dollops, trying to get them about the same size as each other, and then I'm using the back of the spoon to swipe the frosting upwards, wiping the spoon off after each swipe so that it doesn't drag buttercream onto the next dollop. I'm piping the next row of dollops so that they overlap the previous row, so that they completely cover the cake and none shows through in between the dollops. I'm swiping up again with my spoon, and you can see that the buttercream goes further when it doesn't have to go over a division between the layers of cake. So if you have a crumb coat on your cake, this technique is a bit easier, but it's definitely possible without a crumb coat. Just make sure that your cake is chilled so it's less crumbly, and then you shouldn't get any crumbs in the frosting. More rows of dollops and more swiping, all the way up to the top of the cake. And for the top row, I'm swiping a few times for each dollop to make sure I'm covering up all of the cake underneath the buttercream. Again, I'll be demonstrating this technique on the top of the cake later, after finishing the sides. For the next section, I'm using a 1M tip, holding my piping bag horizontally and applying pressure to squeeze a strip of frosting all the way up the cake, using my indented line as a guide to make sure I'm piping straight up. You'll notice that if you move your bag more slowly than you're squeezing the buttercream out of the buttercream line will wiggle, and if you move your piping bag faster than you squeeze the buttercream, the line will break apart. Make sure each line goes up above the top of the cake slightly, so that there's no cake exposed up there. You can use this technique to pipe horizontally instead of vertically if you prefer. For this next colour, I've tinted a few different balls of buttercream with different shades of green, stirred slightly together so that the frosting is blended. This is a 4B tip, an open star, and I'm squeezing a row of rosettes onto the very bottom of the side of the cake. And then for the next row, I'm piping each rosette in the dip between the 2 rosettes below it, to make sure I'm completely covering up the cake underneath. Because the piping bag has blended buttercream in it, all of the shades of green are coming out in the rosettes, adding some interest to the pattern. You can alternate piping bags with different colours of buttercream to get a more colourful effect. This technique will work with other piping tips, like a 1M, a 2B, or different sizes of open stars like an 8B. If this tutorial is useful, please click the thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel to see a new cake decorating tutorial every week. Make sure your rosettes go up to the very top of the cake. The next technique uses a piping bag with no tip, and I'm using the bag to apply buttercream to the cake, which I'm then going to texture with a spoon, so it doesn't matter what it looks like at this point. The aim is just to cover up the cake with buttercream. You can spread the buttercream on instead if you prefer, but you're more likely to drag crumbs off the cake, which will then get into your buttercream. Once the cake is covered with buttercream, I'm using the back of a spoon to swipe the buttercream upwards all the way up the side of the cake, each one overlapping the previous swipe of buttercream, leaving a pointed tip at the top of the cake. Wipe the spoon clean after each swipe. And you can use an offset spatula for this instead, and you'll get a flatter texture, instead of this curved texture that the spoon makes. The spoon or spatula will leave ridges of buttercream along the sides of each swipe, which gives the cake a nice rustic-looking texture. Make sure the swipes go up above the top of the cake to cover it up, and if they don't, you can add some more buttercream and swipe again to blend the buttercream swipes seamlessly. Finally, this is a large petal tip, and I'm holding it so that the narrow end is pointing upwards, starting at the top of my cake and piping sideways to create a ruffle around the cake. I'm piping this slightly higher than the top of the cake to cover up the cake completely, and then I'm piping the next ruffle so that it overlaps this one by about half, so that there's no cake visible between the buttercream. Because the top end of the tip is narrower than the bottom, the top edge of the buttercream wiggles and curves to make a pretty ruffle. You can start at the bottom of the cake instead, holding the tip with the narrow part facing down, and work your way up the cake, and the ruffle will be pointing down like the ruffles of a layered skirt. The slower you move your piping bag, the more wavy your ruffles will be. Okay, so this is what the different textures look like on the side of a cake. Of course, you can just use one texture for the entire cake. I just wanted to demonstrate all of them for you. Now for the top. I'm applying this frosting with my spoon to cover up the blue section, and then swiping it towards the middle of the cake to continue the direction of the swipes from the side of the cake. For the ruffles, I'm using the same technique as on the sides, accidentally piping a ruffle at the base of the section, but the ruffles should begin at the top, or the middle of the cake, since the narrow part of the tip is pointing towards that. Now the small petal tip, continuing the ribbons from the side of the cake, but for the top they won't be the same width. They'll get narrower as you go in towards the centre of the cake. These ones are so much fun to pipe. Now the dollops, piping 3 and then swiping them, and then just piping 2 and swiping those. And if you did the whole cake with this design, you could pipe a single dollop in the centre at the end. Next, the 1M lines, and I'm not continuing all of them to the centre point of the cake, so that I can create a wedge shape instead of a rectangle. And finally, these rosettes with the open star tip, covering up the last section of the cake. And there it is! 6 easy, fun textures to decorate a cake when you don't have a turntable. For my free online course on 10 more frosting techniques, including ombre, buttercream stripes, and watercolour frosting, click the link in the screen or in the description below this video. Thanks for watching!